And for me, Islamophobia is a form of racism. The war on terror is a political project that has really driven the installation of anti-Muslim racism in the 21st century. This construction of the Muslim as the terrorist is a racialized category. It's a category that suggests that Muslims are inherently different, essentially different, biologically different, because they have this kind of inclination towards political violence. I think there's a political will to define Muslim people in a particular way. Muslim women, they allow Islam and Muslims to be identified as anti-feminist and therefore anti-civilizational. And if
Okay.
you're anti-civilizational, then you have been defined as this threat to the West, as both an ontological and ideological threat to the West.
How would a racialized Muslim and a racialized Islam look like?
There's nothing very controversial with saying that Islamophobia is a kind of modern anti-Semitism.
Do you believe that the Islamists and these Islamophobes, they are actually two faces of the same coin? They understand Islam in the same way, they approach
Uh-huh.
Muslim cultures in the same way. The one is just opposing what the other accepts. If you just look at the world we currently live in, you are going to see wars, you are going to observe conflicts, you are going to witness mass starvations, you are going to witness the biggest prison on the surface of the earth. And all of these things are happening mostly in societies and places that are Muslim majority. But at the same time, you are going to confront certain narratives about Muslim that says that Muslims are potential terrorists, Muslims are extremists, Muslims are very prone to violence, Muslims are misogynist, they don't know how to interact with their women, they don't know how to protect their women, they don't know how to take care of their women. Muslims are anti-Semites, they hate Jews. So you could see the contradiction between what is actually happening on this earth and the different narratives that are constructed and that are getting constructed about Muslims. And the question then definitely arises, what explains this contradiction between the reality and these constructed narratives? Why these narratives are getting constructed? For what purposes? What aim do these narratives serve? Is it Islamophobia? If Islamophobia, then what is actually Islamophobia? It is not just simply hatred against Muslim. Why there is so much fixation on Muslim women and on this idea of protecting Muslim women from Muslim men? And and this, by the way, is even more interesting to me. What makes these Islamophobe and Islamist the same? To what an extent Muslims themselves have internalized this Islamophobic version of Islam? To what extent Muslims have internalized these Islamophobes narratives about Islam and about Muslims? These are some of the questions that are probed in this conversation with Professor Amina Shareef. Professor Amina Shareef teaches in University of London, and she is a researcher of anti-Muslim racism. And there is one thing that I am going to ask. Please do share your opinion, what you think about Islamophobia and the arguments that are made in this conversation. We decided to have a conversation on Islamophobia and the consequent Muslim dehumanization, which, as far as you are concerned, actually paves the way literally for Muslim death. I think like the first thing that I have in mind about this is like, what is, as far as you are concerned, what is the current dominant understanding of Islamophobia, and how do you personally approach this term, Islamophobia?
Right. I think that's a really good place to start,
Yeah.
to start with definitions. And
Mm.
my understanding of the dominant definition of Islamophobia is that, it's constructed or it's seen as a kind of bias or a prejudice. And what we know about the concept of bias and the concept of prejudice is that it comes out of this discipline, it comes out of psychology discipline. And essentially, the problem with this approach to understanding Islamophobia is that it locates the problem of Islamophobia inside people's problematic psyches. And it locates the problem of Islamophobia in the prejudicial thinking of, these socially aberrant individuals. And unfortunately, there is political interest in defining Islamophobia as a kind of prejudice or bias, because then what it does is it closes off consideration of Islamophobia as a structural project, of Islamophobia as a knowledge project, of Islamophobia that has global dimensions, even. So, my approach to Islamophobia, therefore, moves away from the school of prejudice studies. And I locate myself in the school of racism studies when it comes to the study of Islamophobia. And for me, Islamophobia is a form of racism. It's a
Okay.
form of racism that approximates other kinds of racism, such as anti-Black racism or anti-Jewish racism. And it approximates these forms of racism by having a similar structure. It has this racial knowledge about Islam and Muslims that secures and legitimizes racial structures that expose Muslim populations to death and to policies of management and containment. So that's my definition of Islamophobia, and we can go from there.
Okay, so there were like two things that you pointed to. Like the first is the global dimension. Quite often we say that Islamophobia is a Western phenomena, and you said that it's like a global phenomena. And the second thing, race. Like, what made you think that Muslims are actually race?
Right, right. Okay. Two really good questions. So let's start with the global dimension. For me, it's really important to understand that the war on terror is a political project that has really driven the installation of anti-Muslim racism in the 21st century. So Islamophobia derives its concepts and its racial knowledge through the discourses and the practices of the war on terror. And I can
Okay.
give some concrete examples. We have counter-extremism policies that span the globe. They are promoted by the UN. They are promoted by governmental and non-governmental organizations that have global reach. They are promoted by UNESCO, for example, the counter-extremism policies that are implemented in the education sector. So we have this global architecture that privileges this view of Muslim people as prone to radicalization
Mm-hmm.
and privileges this view of Islam as this kind of ideological basis for the radicalization of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what this knowledge that is produced through policies and discourses of the war on terror, what this knowledge does is that it racializes Muslim people
Mm-hmm.
as potential terrorists,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it constructs Muslim people as potential terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for me, the construction of the Muslim as a potential terrorist is a kind of racialization. And so here I'll respond to your second question, which is how is Islamophobia a form of racism? Well, racism, what is racism? For me, racism is the identification of people as discrete and essential racial categories, right? Racism is a political project that looks out at the sea of human difference and it identifies certain characteristics as expressive of the phenotypical or expressive of the essential nature of a racial category,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so racism is therefore this process of making racial groups.
Okay.
And another way of talking about racism, therefore, is racialization. And so this construction of the Muslim as the terrorist is a racialized category. It's a category that suggests that Muslims are inherently different, essentially different, biologically different, because they have this kind of inclination towards political violence. They have something within them, some genetic basis for being inclined towards terrorism and
Mm-hmm.
violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where, for me, anti-Muslim racism, it's a form of racism because it ascribes racial difference to Muslim people through the language of terrorism.
But again, like there are certain the idea that Islamophobia is actually paving the way for the premature death of Muslim is a very radical idea, I think, and I would come to this question as well. You just said, and I would ask about this. Do you believe like the Islamophobe they are making this construction just because they don't know enough about the Muslim societies and Muslim, or it is like politically convenient to be this much reductive in their understanding of Islam and Muslim society. So is it like intentional, or a sort of they are misinformed about the Muslim societies or Islam?
Right. That's a really important question. And it's a question that we often hear when we talk about the continued significance of race and racism in our societies today. Many Western countries like to define themselves as post-racial. They're multicultural, they embrace difference, they accommodate, religious practices and so on and so forth. And so this sort of narrative, what it does is that it suggests, no, it likes to convey this idea that we, as a set of nations, are not racist because we don't intend to be racist, right?
Mhm,
We are not racist because we do all these great things for our racialized populations, our minoritized communities. But it's not so much about the intention, but the effects of our
mhm,
policies. And sometimes it's not so much about how much we are aware of how racist our policies are, but rather what kind of consequences, material consequences they have on those racialized populations. So I'll give you an example.
mhm.
You can tell me all day long that the UK is not racist, but if I sit down and I analyze its counter-extremism policy, such as Prevent, right? Which aims to stop people from becoming terrorists, and it does so, and then it does so by asking teachers to monitor students for signs of radicalization. And when we look at who teachers are actually referring to Prevent as being at risk of radicalization, we see that they are mostly Muslim students who are being referred to this program.
Mhm.
So the policy, it can claim that it's not racist all it wants. But when you look at the effects of the policy in terms of how it's implemented, there's a very clear um, implementation that targets a racialized category.
Mhm.
And so the question, therefore, of intention, um, for me, is not one that really matters.
Okay.
What matters is the effects of these policies and these practices.
Mhm.
Now, to your point then, or to your question about do these countries not know enough about Islam and Muslims, and therefore they are producing Islamophobia? I think there's a political will to define Muslim people in a particular way.
Okay.
Because once you do, then you can legitimize all sorts of political projects,
Yes.
such as military intervention,
Yes.
such as displacement of people from their land, such
Yes.
as extraction of Muslim resources,
Yes.
when you do that, because these these Muslim people, they become people that deserve, right? Deserve to be militarily invaded and killed and um, pushed off their land and so on and so
Yeah.
on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think like it's a very important point. I think I don't know if I had said this to you, but I interested in this topic of Islamophobia because I personally think that there is like a particular way in which Islam is constructed, and that construction of Islam has been internalized by a Muslim as well. For example, the certain Orthodox figures who say that we are like far more near to God and we understand religion better than anyone else. I think they have to a far more greater extent internalize those ideas as well. And you touched upon a bit this point as well, but I want to stretch it a bit further. Like, what is the end game of this Islamophobia? Like, if a person wants to kill Muslim and for that reason is engaged in this anti-Muslim racism, why? Like, he wants to do away with Muslim just because they are Muslim. Like, what is the purpose of this necropolitics?
Right, right. That's a wonderful question, and I'm really glad that you're asking it because it allows me to make connections with a previous podcast
Yeah.
that I did, and I think you listened to it with the Thinking Muslim. And so in that podcast, I say that, yes, we can talk about representation of Muslims. we can talk about the effects of those representations on Muslim people's lives. But if we don't take that analysis one step further and talk about what the implications are,
Mm-hmm.
then we're not getting a full picture of what anti-Muslim racism does to Muslim people. So
Yeah.
let me just back that up and give some examples. Muslim women are represented in a particular way,
Yeah.
right? We know they are represented as oppressed by Muslim men.
Yeah.
Now, that
We
policy,
the
this
oppressors.
representation,
We are specifically
yes,
more oppressors. We are Pakhtuns as well, so we are like far more oppressors.
extra oppressors, right?
Yeah.
So, so this representation of Muslim women as oppressed, it has particular effects on Muslim women, right? It means that Muslim women are not allowed to, for example, practice their hijab because the hijab becomes conflated with oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Then, what ends up happening then when Muslim women are not able to practice their hijab because it's seen as oppression?
Mm-hmm.
It means that Muslim women are not employed, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're less
Yeah.
likely to be employed. They have lower educational attainment. They are dismissed in healthcare settings as, not knowing what they want. And in the context of childbirth, we
Mm-hmm.
know that they're not given appropriate pain relief, and sometimes their children, their babies even are put in situations where they end up dying
Mm-hmm.
because Muslim women are not taken seriously because of the hijab and because of the understanding around the hijab as this tool that sort of desubjectifies Muslim women. So now, this is our analysis so far.
Mm-hmm.
Representation of Muslim women leads them to experience exclusions from social goods and resources. But what happens next is my point,
Mm-hmm.
which is that when you are denied access to education, when you are denied access to employment, when you are denied access to proper health and healthcare,
Mm-hmm.
then you are denied access to flourishing, human flourishing, and to life itself.
Yeah.
What you've been denied access to is the opportunity to live a full life, right? And therefore, you are subjected to this kind of slow death,
Okay.
right? And this is why I say that Islamophobia, it its end game is death itself of Muslim populations. Now, to respond to your question, is the purpose death of Muslim populations? Is that like the brutal, is that the kind of, end all, be all objective of Islamophobia? Well, you have political theorists, and you mentioned necropolitics. You have political theorists who recognize that there is this kind of necropolitical force that animates political projects.
Mm-hmm.
And this necropolitical force has this logic that my life only can flourish if the other's life is put to death, right? The
Oh.
flourishing of my life depends on the destruction of other life. And we can see this with terrorism discourse, right? If Muslims are constructed as a threat, then a threat needs to be eliminated in order for me to secure my existence. I cannot be safe from terrorism unless I deal with that terrorist threat. And that dealing of the terrorist threat comes through death dealing technologies, whether it's directly with death, such as targeted killing, military intervention, or it could be slow death, such as
Wow.
um, indefinite detention without charge, through incarceration, through policies of containment, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is how I would respond to your question.
Yeah, I think quite often, as I said, like there are certain people who have internalized these ideas so much within Pakistan as well, and they would like in criticism of the religious establishment as it exists in Pakistan, they would like forget this point that there is actually a particular politics to this Islamophobia. You mentioned, for example, like wars, resources, etc. I remember when I like when I was in college, I was reading a book of Leila Abu Lughad, I think that is her name.
Yes.
She had said like this point that the war on terror was also called a war to protect Muslim women from
Right.
Muslim men. Why the Islamophobes are like too much concerned with the situation of women? Like they
Yeah.
are like far more sensitive towards the women issue more than they are from the Muslim themselves. Like why they are, this issue of women is so central to the discourse of Islamophobia. I was listening to some people, they would say two things: Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So Muslims are anti-Semites, they hate Jews, and they don't know how to protect their women, how to take care of their women. They are oppressing women, they are exploiting women. So why this figure of woman is so central to this discourse?
Yes. Amazing question. I'm so glad you asked it because my real interest with Islamophobia is understanding how gender and Muslim women
Hmm.
are so central in the production of um, Islam as this threat to the West.
Wow.
Now, the reason why there is such a fixation on Muslim women is because we allow the West to define itself as this place of modernity, this place of civilization, this place of progress, of women's equality, of female emancipation, of sexual liberation, right?
Hmm.
And then in contrast, Islam is defined as this space of darkness. It's identified as this realm that's stuck in a state of nature. It cannot progress into the age of gender equality and the age of the rule of law. It cannot progress into modernity.
Hmm.
And the Muslim woman allows this oppositional definition of Islam in the West to take place, or it allows the racialization of Islam and the West to take place together. Now, the Muslim woman is only known, I argue, in two figures. One figure, Shireen Razak, she calls the imperiled Muslim woman. And you mentioned her. She's this woman that is, eternally known as mutilated, confined, subjugated. She has no rights. She has no voice. She has no agency. She has no choice. She is an object. She has been completely desubjectified, right?
Yeah.
She's not a subject. She's an object of a Muslim man's control and will. And then you have another figure, which is what I'm calling the perilous Muslim woman. And it's this Muslim woman who poses a threat to Western security because she is a victim of Muslim misogyny. She's so vulnerable. She's such an object. She's been so objectified that she is vulnerable now to the radicalizing ideologies of Muslim
Yeah.
men. And therefore, she's at risk of radicalization and she's susceptible to being, brought into the fold of the cause of terrorism. And therefore, she poses a threat to Western security. So those are the
Wow.
two ways that Muslim women are noble. And in both cases, they are essentially, victims of Muslim men. Now, as victims of Muslim men, Muslim women are they allow Islam and Muslims to be identified as anti-feminist and therefore anti-civilizational. And if
Okay.
you're anti-civilizational, then you have been defined as this threat to the West, as both an ontological and ideological threat to the West. And the moment that happens is the moment you can justify military intervention. You can justify all sorts of disciplinary practices that manage and contain and surveil Muslim populations.
Yeah.
So that is why the Muslim woman is such a fixation when it comes to Islamophobic discourses. It's because she allows the West to construct Islam as this threat and therefore justify all sorts of political projects that are taking place across the world.
You point to this idea of Islam versus West. I think I was reading a book on this topic of Islamophobia, and there was this point that Islamophobia is something that is now like the defining features of the West because the West defines itself in opposition to Islam. And Islamophobia is like not something on the fringe of society, like on certain edges, but it is something that is like inherent to the very political establishment and the very political system because that defines itself in opposition to Islam. Do you subscribe to this argument that Islamophobia is not like a minority people who subscribe to these ideas, but it's something which is like inherent to the West and the political establishment and political systems or whatever?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. And here I'm thinking about the concept of racialization, specifically Frantz Fanon's concept of
Hmm.
racialization, which I'm sure you have come across. And he argues in Black Skin, White Masks that, anti-Black racism allows the white subject to define itself in relation to the black subject, right? So whiteness is defined in relation to blackness. In other words, what whiteness does is that it projects all its reviled qualities and characteristics onto the other in order to define itself as pure and unique and different from blackness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so and so whiteness here is not a naturalized property of white people, but it's constructed by projecting and casting out all of those repudiated characteristics onto the racial other. But essentially, in that process of racialization, what you have is this constitutive relationship between white and black.
Mm-hmm.
White wouldn't exist unless it created blackness, right?
Okay.
Whiteness needs blackness to produce itself. Right?
Okay.
Whiteness only comes into existence by saying it is not black and it's
Mm-hmm.
not all of those qualities that have been associated with blackness. So, thinking with this framework of racialization, the West cannot define itself as, you know, the exclusive place where women are liberated and empowered and where sexual liberation happens, unless it has this other, i.e.,
Yeah.
Islam, that is this place where women are subjected to all sorts of gender subjugation and subordination
Mm-hmm.
and and allows therefore the West to produce itself in that particular way.
Yeah.
So yes, I agree with you that the very identity of the West depends on Islam because it has to cast away all of those characteristics that it doesn't want to attribute to itself, such as, you know, and then in the process, it defines itself as, the place where women flourish and have rights and where women can progress.
Here I want to ask a very, I think, childish question. I was listening to Jordan Peterson, and he quite often makes the argument that the Western civilization is actually based on like these Judeo-Christian tradition and etc. etc. And like here I am from Pakistan, from a very dysfunctional institutions of education I have gained or acquired my education. We know, and like everyone else as well, how these civilizations have met and how they have learned from each other. Like quite often we say, and even they accept like how Islam contributed to the West. Why is like there this like taking away only Judaism and Christianity as something that is inherent to the West or something that has contributed to the West, and like doing away with Islam? Now there is like, for example, acceptance of other religion as well. For example, Buddhism, Hinduism. There are quite positive opinions about these religions, even in, let's say, for example, New Atheist movement. So why Islam specifically?
Yeah, very important question. And I think we can find the answer here when we think about theology, right?
Okay.
Theologically, Christianity had no problem with Judaism in the sense
Okay.
that it accepted all the prophets of Judaism. It accepted, the stories of Judaism, the
Mhm.
prophets, the prophets of David and Solomon and Jacob and Joseph and so on and so forth. And it just said, look, we're going to add one more, Jesus, right? It's a prophet. You guys, of course, the Jews didn't accept Jesus, but theologically, the Christians didn't have any problem with
Okay.
Judaism.
Okay.
Now, but Christians never accepted the Prophet ﷺ as a messenger of God. And so their sort of problem with us is theological at its origin in the sense that they reject the Prophet ﷺ and they see us as sort of having copied parts of Judaism and Christianity to sort of create ourselves as this, final message of God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's one problem they have with Islam. And now Islam poses a real challenge then to like a Christian um, conception of itself because it's saying, actually, no, Jesus wasn't the Son of God.
Uh-huh.
Jesus wasn't a final prophet. There is another prophet that has come, and the 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 religion of Islam actually concludes this long, direct sort of chain of prophets and this entire kind of monotheistic religion of God, right? Islam is the conclusion, and many people have said Judaism, it's the Old Testament, Christianity is the New Testament, and Islam is the final testament.
Oh,
And so Islam coming and saying, actually, yes, there is a final testament and it's the Quran.
hmm.
That is a very strong theological statement, right?
Yeah.
And it's a theological statement that challenges the very the theology um, of Christianity. So I think to answer your question, that's why there's this doing away with Islam, is because it challenges their very theology. And because the New Atheist movement and other religious groups such as, the Buddhists and so on and so forth, they don't challenge, Christianity theologically. They don't try to say that, well, there's a missing piece to your story here, and it's Islam, it's the final testament.
Yeah.
They're just saying we exist as these people with this faith tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's a real value in understanding this sort of theological lineage that Islam is trying to attach itself to in order to understand why there's so much beef and
Yeah.
resistance to Islam.
Yeah, like again, as I said, when I was listening to these people, a person said that Muslim believe in Jesus. Okay, that's a good point, great. But Muslims don't believe that Jesus is the son of God. I said like that's and that's the reason Islam is Islam and Christianity is Christianity, because there are distinctions between the two, and that's okay if there are distinctions between the two. If the two were the same, like why call one Christianity and another Islam? Now,
That's right.
I would again like to come to this question of Islamophobia. You have touched upon these points a bit as well, not a bit but quite a lot, but I want you to argue specifically about the constituent elements of this anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. Like, if I could say that Islamophobia is a factory sort of, what kind of Islam and what kind of Muslim is constructed in this factory? What kind of images and narratives? Like, another way, how would a racialized Muslim and a racialized Islam look like?
That's a really tough question. It's a tough question because you're asking me to sort of give you some typologies of how Islamophobia produces the Muslim. And I'll tell you in a moment why I think that's a hard thing to do for
Hmm.
me to
Hmm.
come up with these typologies. But first, I think if you have this Islamophobia factory, which I think is a great way to visualize this, right? And I think we need to create visuals for people to help them understand difficult concepts. So, okay, so you have this factory and it's producing Islamophobia, it's churning it away, it's manufacturing this thing called Islamophobia. What does it produce first? Well, it produces knowledge, okay?
Okay.
Racial knowledge. Some people call racial knowledge representation, some people call it stereotypes, right? But the point is, you're producing an idea about Islam and Muslims that suggests that they are a race apart,
Hmm.
that suggests that they are a racial category that is, biologically bound, that is inherently different, right?
Hmm.
And the second thing, therefore, this factory is producing, churning away, manufacturing, is a racial structure,
Hmm.
right? Because the moment you have this knowledge about a particular people, it's translated in everyday life, right? It
Hmm.
has real material effect in
Yeah.
terms of the kind of institutions that are produced. And so then the racial structures would take the form of exclusions from educational opportunity, from employment opportunity,
Yeah.
from health and healthcare, which we mentioned
Yeah.
already. So this is how I would see this factory in terms of what it produces. Now, the thing with racial knowledge is that it it has to be agile. It has
Mhm.
to be adaptive to different political needs in order to be relevant,
Mhm.
right? So during the time of European colonialization, you had Orientalism, which was this kind of racial knowledge
Yeah.
about the Orient, and it produced racial knowledge about Muslim people as well.
Mhm.
Now, the racial knowledge that it produced allowed the European colonial enterprise to justify itself,
Yeah.
right? And so here, what I'm trying to say is that the racial knowledge is directly tied to the project that it needs to justify and legitimize and um, establish as worthy. So in the war on terror, you had different racial knowledge that was produced because you needed to do different work. You needed to justify a different political project, which is the war on terror,
Yeah.
right? And So the racial knowledge today, it comes through discourses of terrorism,
Hmm.
and it comes through this idea of Muslims as, inherently inclined towards political violence, and it comes out of this idea of Islam as producing or giving the ideological basis for terrorism. So this is why I say that it's hard for me to tell you what a typical racialized Muslim looks like, because over time, racial knowledge of Islam and Muslims has to be agile and different to
Yeah.
respond to the political expediencies of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, okay. So if I have understood your point correctly, you said that like this colonial enterprise is changing and it has like different political objectives as the time passes, and for that reason it has to come with different ideas about the people, let's say about Muslim. And in that
Definitely.
regard, it will like continue to construct Islam and Muslim differently in order to suit those political projects. But
That's
as
right.
I had pointed out, don't you believe like this racial knowledge is to a very greater extent somehow internalized by certain Muslims from the Orthodox? I'm speaking like about the Orthodox, not about the general Muslim population. They have internalized this Islam as well. Like for example, if I am listening to some Islamophobe or let's say some liberal like the New Atheist movement, and they say that Islam is a violent religion which believes in jihad, and it says that wage your jihad against the infidels. Well, that is the same argument that I could see some Orthodox Muslim also making. If those Islamophobes say that Muslim oppress women and that Islam is oppressing women, like I have heard this argument for the first time from scholars who say that women are half of men. Like I
Right.
haven't heard this argument for the first time from the Islamophobes, but from the people who believe that they are Muslim, they are Islamic scholar, etc., etc. So don't you believe like they have also internalized these ideas and they do believe in these ideas as well?
Yes, yes. Absolutely. I do agree. And this is the third time you've mentioned internalized Islamophobia, and I'm glad you're insisting on it because it is
Yeah.
worth unpacking and talking about. One aspect of the research that I do is to look at how uh, this racial knowledge of Islam and Muslims, it comes into contact with Muslim people,
Hmm.
and then it doesn't just stay at the surface of Muslim people's bodies, but it enters their bodies and it enters their subjectivity, how they understand themselves,
Yeah.
and then it interacts with it and it shapes, therefore, how they see themselves and then how they become and who they
Yeah.
become,
Yeah.
right? So this is an integral part of my research, and my research has found that young Muslim women,
Hmm.
or Muslim girls between the ages of 12 and 18, when they encounter Islamophobia or the representation um, that they're oppressed or they're dangerous, they try to distance themselves from those representations, right?
Hmm.
And by distancing themselves from those representations, they also distance themselves from the practices that are associated with those representations. So, for example, if the hijab is
Yeah.
associated with being oppressed, then they take off the hijab, or they don't want to wear the hijab, or they'll wear the hijab in a way that sort of becomes more like an
Yeah.
expression of fashion as opposed to religion. And so there's definitely that aspect here to consider, which is the interaction of racial knowledge on Muslim people's subjectivities.
Yeah.
And we know the colonial enterprise was also sought to remake the world in the image of itself,
Yeah.
to remake the rest of the world in the image of the West, right?
Hmm.
That is, Western concepts had to be they had to be appreciated by the rest of the world as being superior and as being the only way to establish the cultural, political, economic, and social formations in a society. The colonial project, that's why the colonial project in various colonies involved going into schools, teaching, you know, British literature, for example, teaching British history, for example, so that the people wouldn't know themselves. They would only know themselves in relation to the West and only see the West as therefore being um, the the supplier of the concepts
Hmm.
by which we should order and configure our lives. So going back to your comment then on Muslim people internalizing Islamophobia. I
Yeah.
think when they do that, some of them are genuinely concerned about their safety. So, for example, Muslim women who go out on the street and they don't want to, they take off the hijab because they're scared of being attacked. That is a legitimate concern. But in other cases, you have, scholarship, Muslim scholarship, or the scholarly community that is nothing more than a mouthpiece than for the West
Mm-hmm.
when it sort of reproduces the racial knowledge that the West has constructed in order to control and manage Islam, right?
Yeah.
And when they do that, they have a particular religious authority and they are able to convince people. And so that's quite dangerous. It's
Yeah.
quite dangerous because people start to take what the religious authority tells them as a part of the religion itself, and then that can have consequences for the way people understand Islam.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's really important to talk about internalized Islamophobia.
Yeah, yes, and I wanted to talk about this point because, like, when I was in college, and quite often when we used to speak about Islam, and if there were like certain criticisms of Islam, I just now realize that these are the ideas that are with us, and that has this origin in these Islamophobe and those wars that the U.S. had fought in these Muslim majority countries in order to justify those wars. They have come up with certain narratives about Islam. They have come up with certain narratives about Muslims and their culture, and we have also internalized those narratives. Now when we are criticizing Muslim cultures, which we should criticize if there is anything worth criticizing, and if we are criticizing Islam, we are actually criticizing Islam and Muslim culture on the basis of those same points. We are just parroting those ideas. Like, within Pakistan, if someone say that Islam is like a religion which is not as good, why? Because it oppresses women. Like, those
Yeah,
same arguments are here with us as well.
sure.
When people, as you quite often said, the West and Islam, don't you believe that you also somehow reproduces those categories that lend some credit to this clash of civilization thesis? Because you also define Islam against the West somehow, or if I am wrong, you can correct me, and that there is something fundamentally wrong with the West. So we are educated with Western curriculum. That is wrong because it's from the West and we are Muslim. We are educated in these Western philosophies. They are wrong because we are Muslims and they are Western. So don't you believe that we are somehow like giving credit to this to that thesis which we would otherwise oppose?
Thanks again for another great question. And yes, I mentioned in a previous podcast that some of what I some of what I stand by might, reproduce this idea of a clash of civilizations. And what I do believe is that Islam is not liberalism, right?
Okay.
So if liberalism is the dominant political ideology of the world, right? It is the dominant political ideology of the world because it is the political ideology that determines, rights. It determines the relationships between states. It determines the kind of obligations that states have to international charters and treaties and so on and so forth. Liberalism is a political ideology, but at the same time, it's a kind of metaphysics as well. What do
Mm-hmm.
I mean by that? Metaphysics is essentially it's a worldview. It tells you, how you should it tells you how you should establish a particular value system. But a value system, right? Such as people have rights and states have the right to sovereignty and people have the right to security and life and religious expression. This is a value system. Now, a value system such as liberalism emerged out of Enlightenment thinking, right? And Enlightenment thinking, it tried to move away from religion.
Yeah.
It tried to create a man-centered world, right? And it moved away from a God-centered world
Yeah.
in which religion defined how people would live their life. Religion defined how people understood who they were and how they were going to live in this world, right? Religion defined that in in pre-Enlightenment Europe. But Enlightenment Europe tried to move away from all of that. And it tried to say, look, human beings, we have our own choice. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have to submit to the will of God. We have a will of our own, and we have agency that we can pursue, which is the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of freedom and so on and so forth, instead of the pursuit of God's happiness and the pursuit of a kind of freedom through a submission to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So liberalism as a value system emerged out of this kind of effort to move away from religion.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore it's a kind of religion in that it gives you an ontology. It tells you what exists, that it's not a God-centered world anymore, but it's a man-centered world. And and therefore this is how you should live your life. Now, Islam, on the other hand, we don't have a problem with freedom and rights and so on and so forth. So long as they are sort of understood within an Islamic framework, in the sense that the liberal subject is not the same as the Tawhidic subject,
Yeah.
the subject that submits to God, and the subject that doesn't live her life in pursuit of happiness and freedom, right? The Tawhidic subject is one who submits to the will of God. And so you can see here that there is a difference, therefore, then between the liberal subject and the Tawhidic subject. And and this is and so this is where people might say, okay, then you're falling into the clash of civilizations. Well, I'm saying this so that Muslims don't fall into this they don't fall into this politics where they have to say Islam is compatible with liberal thought and Islam is liberalism itself and Islam, look at these Islamic concepts and they approximate liberal concepts. I don't want Muslims to fall into that kind of trap where they
Yeah.
have to constantly prove that we are, you know, that we can be whitened and that
Yeah.
we try to whiten Islam through by making it close to liberalism. The moment we do that is the moment we see Muslim women protesting their right to wear hijab. And what do they write on these posters? They write, "My body, my choice." This is a liberal understanding of the hijab. For me, I would never say my body, my choice for the hijab, because it's not my body, it's God's, it's this amana that God has given, and it's not my choice really. If I am a Muslim, I submit to the will of God and I wear the hijab. Yes, it's my choice to submit, but it's not a choice in a liberal sense where the woman has the choice to do with her body regardless of religion, regardless of authority, regardless of anyone around her, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why some may say that I fall into this clash of civilizations logic, but at the same time, I want to retain the identity of
Yeah.
Islam, right? I want to retain the identity of the Muslim without saying that we are them. We
Yeah.
are the same. And so let's just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, right? We're
Yeah.
not going to do that, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No, I think I agree with your point, and I think the people I have quite often listened to, those who become who like become very defensive when it comes to Islam, and who are trying to whiten Islam. I'm like equally opposed to those postures as well, and I really find them repulsive as well. I think the point that I wanted to emphasize with this is like, let's say if a person say that I have like a Tawheed centric perspectives, and a person says that I am liberal. Okay, they may have like different reasons for each perspective, but if they both are talking about rights, if they both are talking about the same thing, if they both are talking about, let's say, rule of law, fundamentally the way things get materialized, it's the same. So then there are like not as the distinctions are not as stark as we might say.
Yes, yes. I would say
Okay.
we don't have a problem with liberal rights.
Yeah,
We don't have a problem with the right of state sovereignty or
yeah,
religious freedom and so on and
yeah.
so forth. But for example, we might argue that the right to do whatever you want with your body is not something that we would necessarily agree with, right? And
Hmm.
we could illustrate that with an example with from abortion, but that would
Hmm.
be a contentious thing to do. But
Yeah,
that would be an example of how
yeah,
our understanding of our
yeah.
rights to our own bodies is not the same as the liberal rights
Okay,
to
yeah, wow.
bodies. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was like I'm pulling back I'm pulling back from my argument. You are right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So there are like then certain limits that we will have to recognize when we say that we are Muslim and we believe in this Tawheedic centric perspective. And actually, I have like another point to say about this point as well. You said that we believe in religious freedom, we believe in liberal rights. When I like again, I am from Pakistan, and when I listen to Muslims who are living in the West, and then when I listen to people who are living in Pakistan but who are ideologically secular and liberal, I think like there are actually no as much distinction between the two. Like they would argue for the same thing. I mean, like if Dr. Amina Shareef is in Pakistan, she will be perceived as a very liberal person by the religious establishment.
Oh,
Do you?
me.
Yeah, it's personally my opinion. It could be wrong. It could be like, and it's like related with this idea that we live in different situations, and for that reason our approach to Islam and religion is different, the way we conceive it and the way we understand it. And as I said, I think we owe our understanding of Islam to to that constructed Islam as it got produced in these wars, if
Mm.
that be war against terror, and if that be war against communism. I wanted to ask this, you had said, you said something as well about this, the constituent elements of anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia, for example, the way they understand religion and women, the issue of women. There's also this aspect of anti-Semitism. I think I touched upon this as well, like I mentioned this point. I was listening to a person who said that Muslims are anti-Semites, but on the other side, there is also this argument that Muslims are actual, that Islamophobia is the modern anti-Semitism. So on the one side, we say
Mhm.
Islamophobia is the modern anti-Semitism. On the other side, the Islamophobe would say Muslims are anti-Semitism. So
Yeah.
what is like happening here?
Well, okay, to your first question, Muslims are, the worst form of anti-Semitic people possible on this planet. I
Yeah.
think that's such a rich accusation coming from the West,
Okay.
who has a history of persecuting Jewish people, a history of brutal pogroms against Jewish people, a history of expelling Jewish people from their lands, right? And it's worth also remembering that theologically, if we go back to this theological relationship between Judaism and Christianity, theologically, the Christians believe that the Jewish people killed Jesus, right?
Yeah.
We don't believe that because we don't believe Jesus was actually killed, but the Christians believe that it was the Jews who killed Jesus. And for
Yeah.
many centuries, even, Christian people called Jewish people the killers of God,
Yeah.
right? And this animosity towards the killers of God was the driving force behind a lot of this anti-Semitism um, across European history or across the history of Christendom. And so it's really fresh to say
Yes.
Muslims are the
Yeah.
anti-Semites today, when for centuries this is what Christian people were doing to Jewish people. And again, if we go back to Franz Fanon's definition of racialization, this is like the best example, right? You have the projection of anti-Semitism onto Islam so that the West can identify itself as, the lovers of Jews and therefore create an alliance with Jewish people and advance particular political projects.
Hmm.
Now, to your second question about how I think about Islamophobia as the modern anti-Semitism. I think when I say that Islamophobia is a form of racism, I am suggesting that Islamophobia is similar to other forms of racism, such as anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, right? In that it has a similar structure. There's a racial knowledge that seals and secures this particular racial structure.
Hmm.
And you can see that with anti-Black racism, you can see that with anti-Semitism. And
Okay.
so yes, Islamophobia is not this unique kind of racial formation in that it departs from old ways of racializing people and excluding them from social access or access to social goods and resources.
Hmm.
It approximates these old racial projects. And so there's nothing very controversial with saying that Islamophobia is a kind of modern anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I am like again, someone could say that this Maas from Pakistan is suffering from what Karl Marx Sahib said, false consciousness. You said that this anti-Semitism, and like again now when we talk about Islamophobia, we are often equating it to the West. What is the situation like currently now in India? I was listening to a person, and he was like a prominent person from RSS. He was actually making the same argument about Muslim as would make the Zionist or someone else. So, like, I'm just thinking about like why there is this hatred towards Muslim. Like again, now India is not the West. We cannot say that it has that colonial history. It is like interested in the Middle East oil or etc. etc. etc.
That is a really good question that I'm still working on
Okay.
myself to try and, understand and arrive at some kind of explanation. Now, I do know that there are economic
Mm-hmm.
arguments that are made to explain why India has this kind of animosity to Muslims. And there's this argument that, various nations across the globe, or all nations across the globe, are, hierarchically placed in relation to Western nations, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have the Western nations, Australia, Canada, UK, Europe, and the US. They're at, they're at this sort of core. They're the core, right? They
Mm-hmm.
are the leading superpowers, and they are economically sort of quite prosperous, and they're all, white nations.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these nations that are hierarchically located beneath them
Mm-hmm.
that try to approximate those countries. They try to gain economic advantage. They try to accept the policies and practices of these nations in order to whiten themselves and therefore gain more economic advantage. But so the argument here is that there's economic advantages to gain by these different nations as they whiten themselves and as they become more white. I'm not sure if I fully accept that it's entirely economically motivated.
Okay.
I do think that there are other factors that contribute to the to the installation of Islamophobia in countries that are not non-white countries like
Yeah.
Myanmar, right? Like China, like
Yeah.
India. And I have to do some more research around that. So I think that's where I'll stop in terms of, yeah,
No, yeah,
my
actually, so
response to your
like it
question.
was it was like a sort of personal astonishment for me. I was listening to a professor, as I said, and he is like a person who quite often appears on TV. I'm just forgetting his name. I will email you his name. And he was in Israel, and he was saying like we have a special affinity with Israel, and like this was his argument. And when October 7 happened, we could feel it because like this idea of rape, Muslim raping women, we could
Right.
feel it, because like that has happened with us as well in India. So like that
Sure,
sort of
sure.
argument, like there was then no
Mm.
differences between the arguments that are made against Muslim in these Islamophobic discourses. Like this is now India, and to say that like India is whitening itself, I think it would be a bit not so, what we could say, like we might not do justice to the West if we say this. Like this is too much. I
That's
would
right.
say you
I
agree with
agree
this?
with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think there's something else going on. I think it's more than economic
Yeah.
advantage, more than becoming white. It's more than this colonial, complex that is driving these ex-colonial nations to emulate and imitate the West. I think there's something else going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have yet to figure out what that is.
Yeah, okay, so there is like another question about this point, about this internalization, and like and I want to say this because quite in Pakistan, for example, we make the argument about Jews. Like I used to go to what, a mosque, and there like a Quran would be recited to us.
Yeah.
The scholar would make certain argument about Jews, And these same arguments are now made by the Zionist in this what you call Islamophobia about Muslim. So, like we are talking about the West just because it is like more powerful and the ideas that it is having about the people is consequentially are consequential. For that reason, we are talking about the West. Because as I said, like there are certain ideas, for example, about the Jews that we also have in this country with us. Like if Israel is engaged in genocide against Palestine, it does not mean that all Jews are genocidal.
Yes.
But in certain Muslim majorities countries from these religious establishment, we do hear arguments of this kind. The
Sure,
Jews are
sure.
like, for example, bacteria. They are like,
Yeah, yeah,
etc., etc.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back then to the question of power, right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to the question of racism. So racism, it has to have racial power. It has to have consequence, as you said. Like the racial knowledge has to have material effects on people
Mm-hmm.
for it um, to be racism.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, if it's just these prejudices that people have or things that people say, it hasn't yet become racism yet, right? Even though it's racial knowledge, but the racism has this element of power to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has this element where there is political kind of force behind
Mm-hmm.
these ideas. And this political force means that there's a distribution of life chances,
Yeah.
distribution of resources in
Yeah.
a particular way that benefits some, privileges
Mm-hmm.
some, and disadvantages others.
Mm-hmm.
So sure, people can have all sorts of horrible, horrible ideas about other groups, which is very un-Islamic too,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because Allah says in Surah Al-Hujurat, for example, that do not make fun of other nations, right?
Yeah.
One nation do not make fun of other nations.
Yeah.
Um, and here you can understand nation as another group of people. So it's not because you simply have these horrible ideas that it becomes this kind of racism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless there's kind of racial power behind it, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's
Yeah.
how I might think about that.
It reminded me of Noam Chomsky, rahmatullahi alayhi. So he had said, for example, this point about power, that power brings responsibility, and for that reason, we might be concerned too much with like the people, with the nations who are
Yeah,
currently powerful. But I think
that's
I
right.
wanted to put our attention, or at least like emphasize this point, like, okay, so if the Islamophobes are engaged in some sort of activities, and we could find those same activities happening within our own Muslim majority countries, that means that there is like no more, like we are not morally different from them. It's just that we don't have enough power.
Right, right.
So like if you,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
No, no, go ahead, finish.
Okay, so that was like the point. Like if those people are given the power, they might do the same thing as these Islamophobes are doing.
Right, right. That's a great point about whether we are morally equivalent to people who have the racial power
Yeah,
and who are driving
yeah,
this racial knowledge. Because we know that countries in the Middle East, the Gulf states, like,
yeah.
UAE and, Abu Dhabi, we know that they are partners with the US in um, rolling out counter-extremism policy right in the region. And counter-extremism policy is fundamentally, rooted on this racial knowledge of Muslims as these potential terrorists.
Yeah,
And yet you have these Muslim nations who are working with the West to create racial structures in their
mm-hmm.
own countries around this racial knowledge. And
Yeah,
so, yes, um, there's something to be said then about participating in these racial projects
yeah,
and not being morally different from them, in
yeah.
fact, when you are allowing this to
Mhm.
take place and you are facilitating
Yeah,
this to take place in your
yeah, and
countries.
yeah, and quite often, like using the same argument as these Islamophobe might use. For example, if they said that the Muslims are like primitive kind of people within Pakistan. For example, the ruling establishment by said that in the periphery there are living Pakhtun people, and they are like not as developed as we are. They are not as civilized as we are, and it is they who are like religiously backward people. You know, so they are like actually relying on the same logic.
Sure.
Just their color is different. They are like a bit yellow like me and
Yeah.
brown, and
Uh-huh.
yeah, so that was like the point that I wanted to ask. Like it might be, as I said, like just because they have power and we don't have power, but uh, we are using the same argument, we are relying on the same logic quite often.
Sure.
And
Sure.
do you believe, and I think I had asked this question as well in email, that the Islamists and the people we talked about and these Islamophobes, they are actually two faces of the same coin. They understand Islam in the same way, they approach
Uh-huh.
Muslim cultures in the same way. The one is just opposing what the other accepts. So if a Islamophobe that say that Islamophobe would say that jihad is bad and jihad is that and that, those Islamists would not fundamentally disagree with the way these Islamophobes understand this category of jihad, but he might just say, you disagree with it, you don't accept, I accept.
Uh-huh. Ah, goodness. Two sides of the same coin. Well, sometimes when we use terms like Islamist, we forget at the heart what an Islamist might be, or who
Okay.
exactly are we referring to when we use that term,
Okay.
right? At the end of the day, I think you have Muslim people
Okay.
who start this kind of spiritual engagement with the religion. They try to gain proximity to God. They
Mhm.
want to draw nearness to God. They want to um, live in accordance with God's will and um, his prescriptions,
Mhm.
and live in a society that's also structured by Islamic concepts,
Mhm.
right? Such as maybe interest-free banking
Mhm.
and certain inheritance rules and certain rules with relation to food consumption and so on and so
Mhm.
forth, right? And so these people, we might turn around and call them Islamists,
Mhm.
right? Because they want to take Islam and institutionalize it. They want to
Yeah.
take the religious practices or religious precepts and they want to make it into an institution.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we do a disservice that to those people by
Yeah.
calling them Islamists, because I mean, part of me would also like to live in a society where I could go to a bank and take a loan that's interest-free and buy a house,
Yeah.
right? Part of me wants to live in a society where, um, you know, alcohol is sort of not it's not like, everywhere available and therefore exposing women to harm and children to harm in homes through domestic violence and so on and so forth. Does that make me an Islamist? I don't like that term because it's just sort of putting this political label
Yeah.
on Muslim people who just want to live in accordance with this faith.
Yeah.
So that being said, I know that Yeah, I know that Islamists are sort of seen by Islamophobes as being rabidly anti-Western.
Mhm.
They want to dismantle all Western institutions, cultural, social, economic, and put Islamic institutions in their place. And in some ways, what is the problem with that, right?
No, no problem with that.
What is the what is the problem with this? Okay, let me
Okay.
just finish here one
Mhm.
second. What is the problem with that? What is the problem with a nation that wants to decolonize itself,
Okay.
right? We know that these nations, Muslim majority nations, have been colonized. They have a colonial past with Britain, with France, with so on and so forth. And some of the remaining institutions, many of the remaining institutions were reformed, or they look like Western institutions, and Muslim institutions were reformed to look like and
Yeah.
emulate Western institutions. And so if you have a people who are living in this society that suddenly looks so alien to what it's not consistent with their values,
Mhm.
that doesn't it isn't it not understandable for a group of people to say, hey, let's change the character of these institutions. We're not
Yeah.
going to be involved in these economic systems that, extract wealth from the global south and, move it
Yeah,
into the global north. We're not going to be part of these institutions like the World Bank and IMF that demand austerity measures in order for loans to be given and so on and so forth. What is wrong with the society that says, look, we are going to offer people interest-free loans
yeah,
and we're going to make the purchase of houses available for people and we're going to make education available because we're going to offer student loans that are entirely, debt-free. And I would say there's nothing wrong with that. And the problem with Islamophobes is that they see this attempt to Islamize these institutions as anti-Western, as this kind of virulent hatred towards anything Western.
yeah. And I think Ayan Hirsi Ali would say it is like actually conquering the West, slow steps towards conquering the West. But I 120% you were agree with your point. But I like the point was, let's say, and I mentioned it. Let's say if I see from an Islamophobe who say that uh, Muslim men oppress Muslim women, and they like mention to certain things, like if they say that like the Muslim or Islam believes that women are not as intellectually efficient as men. Like, let's just take a single example. I have
Sure.
heard these points from Muslims,
Yeah.
first from Muslim. So
Yeah.
that was like the point that I just wanted to make. Like, for me, in this case, they are actually two faces of the same coin.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so in this case, and
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
like much similar cases like this, I where I could see that they are actually arguing this. Their approach towards understanding Islam is very similar. It's just one is opposing and the other is disagreeing with it. So that was, and
Definitely.
yeah. So
I agree with you there. I think a lot of Muslims, they have swallowed the discourse of Islamophobia. They reproduce it, they regurgitate it, and that's how they understand Islam.
and it is like so much internalized, like it is so much internalized, and for that reason I said, like, if I say to a Muslim scholar the orthodoxy as they exist in Pakistan, now they have changed a bit, I should also recognize this. But if
Yeah.
the point that you made, if I say these points in front of them, they would say like, you have a you are just a very secular person inspired from the West, and you are just forgetting your Islamic values.
Oh
So
no.
yeah.
Well, I guess I can't make everybody happy.
Yeah. So do you believe like there is anything left that we haven't touched upon and you should
Uh-huh.
talk a bit about?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of territory, and I think we hit the main questions that needed addressing. I think a
Mhm.
lot of people need to hear conversations around the topics that we've discussed, and I think we've discussed them quite thoroughly.
So thank
Yeah.
you so much. I enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot.
Yes.
I quite often say in this conversation that like I am a person who was to the core dissatisfied with the sort of education he was provided me. He was
Okay.
provided with. I mean, like I and for this reason, these are like personalized classes for me, free.
Oh, amazing.
So
Free. That's
so
wonderful.
yeah. So thank you
Well,
so much. Thank you
yes.
so
Thank
much
you for
for being with
inviting
us.
me. And
Thank you so much.
it's amazing that you are doing this. And I mean, here you are educating yourself and creating these spaces of alternative learning for people around the world and people in your country to learn
Mhm.
from. And yeah, congratulations to that.
Okay, no, thank you so
Yeah.
much. Like, it's people like you who allow us this opportunity to keep
Oh.
going with this. So thank you so much.